In this series, I'd like to take you through the story of an empire that stood for centuries, the Byzantine Empire. We'll explore it in 5 episodes, each about an hour long, told slowly and calmly. If you're ready, let's begin. In the early 4th century, the Roman Empire stood at a crossroads. Emperor Constantine the Great had emerged victorious from civil wars by 324 AD, reuniting the empire under his sole rule. With peace restored, he turned his gaze to the east, and to the ancient city of Byzantium on the Bosphorus. Rome, the old capital, had proven unsatisfactory in many practical ways. It lay far from the empire's crucial frontiers, in the increasingly wealthy eastern provinces. The city itself, nestled in central Italy, was distant from the turbulent Danube border and the Persian threat in the east. Rome's venerable streets had also become an arena of political intrigue, and the city suffered from periodic flooding and even malaria in its marshy surroundings. Constantine sought a fresh start in a location that could address these problems while uniting his vast realm. Byzantium offered exactly what the emperor needed. This Greek port city occupied a strategic peninsula straddling Europe and Asia, a true crossroads of trade and culture. Surrounded by water on 3 sides, the Golden Horn Harbor, the Bosphorus Strait, and the Sea of Marmara, it was naturally well defended and could be supplied by sea even in troubled times. From Byzantium, Constantine could respond swiftly to troubles on the Danube frontier in the north, or along the eastern border with Persia. The site lay at the gateway between the Aegean and Black Seas, meaning it controlled the vital maritime trade routes of the region. Caravans and ships from distant lands converged there, bringing silk and spices from the east and grain from Egypt. Constantine realized that a capital at Byzantium would let him tap into the wealth of the eastern provinces and protect the empire's future. It was a calculated political choice. A new capital in the east would solidify Roman power where it was most needed and symbolize the dawn of a unified empire. Having chosen Byzantium, Constantine set in motion an immense project to transform this old provincial town into a world capital worthy of Rome's legacy. Over the span of just a few years, from 324 to 330, Byzantium was reborn as Nova Roma, New Rome, though it would soon be known by the name Constantinople, the city of Constantine. The emperor personally oversaw the city's expansion and design. According to later accounts, he himself walked out the boundaries of the new city, marking a far larger circuit than the old town had encompassed. Indeed, the new Constantinople spread over the prominent hills of the peninsula, echoing Rome's famed 7 hills. To enclose this greater area, workers raised new defensive walls on the landward side, fortifying the city's perimeter against any future siege. A crescent of stout ramparts now guarded Constantinople's only vulnerable approach by land, while the seas and straits around it formed a natural moat. Constantine divided the large city into 14 administrative regions, deliberately mirroring the 14 districts of Rome established by Augustus. In this way, New Rome would be structured like Old Rome from the start. Construction went forward at a breathtaking pace. The emperor was determined to adorn his new capital with all the monuments and amenities an imperial metropolis should possess. Columns, marble blocks, and decorative artworks were hauled in from older cities across the empire to lend splendor to Constantinople's streets. Many of the grand statues and sculptures that graced the city's squares arrived as imperial gifts from places like Athens, Ephesus, and Antioch, giving the new capital a classical beauty and an air of ancient dignity. At the heart of the city, Constantine built a grand new public square, the Forum of Constantine, a circular plaza much like the imperial forums of Rome. At its center rose a monumental column topped by a statue of Constantine himself, dressed as Helios, the sun god, crowned with a radiant halo. This striking monument announced that a new era of imperial glory had begun under Constantine's aegis. Around the forum and along a broad main avenue, the Messe, or Middle Street, rose porticoed walkways, colonnades, and public buildings. A new Senate house was established so that Constantinople would have its own body of senators deliberating under the emperor's eye. Not far away, on a commanding height, the emperor's great palace spread out in a complex of halls, courtyards, and gilded roofs, a luxurious residence from which the affairs of the empire could be directed. Nearby stood the vast hippodrome, an arena able to seat tens of thousands for chariot races and public spectacles. The hippodrome quickly became the social heart of the city, just as the Circus Maximus had been in Rome, allowing the people to assemble and revel in races under the gaze of the ruler. Bathhouses, such as the restored baths of Zeuxippus, offered recreation and hygiene, while fresh water was secured via new cisterns and aqueduct channels. In every direction one could see freshly erected arches, bustling marketplaces, and squares filled with the finest treasures of classical art. What had been a modest Greek town was swiftly transformed into an imperial capital of marble and might. By 330 AD, construction had advanced enough that Constantine was ready to proclaim his new capital to the world. From the outset, Constantine intended his new city not just as a political and commercial hub, but as a shining emblem of his religious vision. As the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity, he wove his faith into Constantinople's very foundation. Unlike old Rome, still dotted with ancient temples to Jupiter, Mars, and countless pagan gods, Constantinople was conceived as a city where the Christian God would be honored above all. The emperor sponsored the building of grand churches to give the city a sacred character from its earliest days. One of the first of these was the Church of the Holy Apostles, built on a high promontory of the city. This was no ordinary church. It was designed as the future mausoleum for Constantine himself and the resting place for saints and martyrs. By planting his own tomb within a church dedicated to the apostles, Constantine symbolically placed himself under the protection of the Christian faith and among the companions of Christ. The new capital, in his eyes, would be a Christian capital, distinct from the old pagan past. Another early foundation was Hagia Irene, Holy Peace, a large basilica that became the city's first cathedral. These churches, with their cross-shaped halls, domes, and altars, proclaimed that Christianity had taken root in the heart of the empire. The skyline of Constantinople soon featured the silhouettes of crosses and church gables, signaling to all that this was a city under Christian guardianship. Indeed, Constantine took steps to ensure that pagan religions would not dominate public life in his new capital. While existing pagan shrines were not immediately destroyed, no grand temples to the old gods were erected by Constantine's order in Constantinople. The traditional civic deities were gradually supplanted by Christian symbols. The ancient altar of Tyche, the Greek goddess of fortune who had personified Byzantium's destiny, was quietly replaced by a symbol of Mary, the Mother of God, or by a personification of Constantinople as a Christian maiden. Such changes set a tone. New Rome would be pious and Christian in character, aligning with Constantine's own embrace of the faith. When Constantinople was officially inaugurated as the new capital, Constantine orchestrated ceremonies that blended Roman imperial pomp with Christian observances. There were feasts, chariot races, and public largesse in the Roman style. But these were accompanied by Christian prayers of thanksgiving and the presence of bishops blessing the city. Later chronicles describe Constantine carrying an icon of Christ or the Virgin Mary at the head of a solemn procession, consecrating the capital to divine protection. In one account, The emperor himself remarked that Christ was the true guide and patron of the new city. Such stories, whether embellished or not, capture the reality that Constantinople was, from the beginning, associated with Christianity's ascendancy. The city was dedicated in the name of God, and many early observers noted that it lacked the multitude of pagan idols that other cities had. Constantinople quickly became a center of Christian activity. It attracted prominent bishops and saints, and within a few decades, it would host councils debating doctrine. All of this had its roots in Constantine's vision of a capital that was not only strategically located and politically fresh, but spiritually renewed. In its first years, Constantinople stood as a tangible sign that the Roman Empire had entered a new Christian age. Constantinople was consciously styled as a New Rome, and in many respects it emulated the grandeur of the old capital on the Tiber. Visitors in the 330s would have recognized familiar elements of Roman civic life transplanted to the shores of the Bosporus. The new city had its own senate and civic magistrates, its forums and colonnaded avenues, and even the same number of regions as Rome. Strolling through Constantinople, one could find echoes of Rome's urban landscape, a great forum bustling with merchants and orators, public baths humming with citizens at leisure, and a hippodrome where roaring crowds cheered charioteers just as they did in Rome's Circus Maximus. The emperor made sure to populate his new capital with the cultural and artistic riches of the classical world, linking it to the heritage of Greece and Rome. In one square, a visitor might see an ancient statue of Athena brought from Athens. In another, a towering monument of the god Apollo, or a heroic emperor of ages past. These imported treasures gave Constantinople an atmosphere of antiquity, as if the spirit of old Rome had been carried eastward and set down in new streets. Ceremonies in the city often deliberately imitated those of Rome. For instance, triumphal processions with Constantine in a golden chariot, or the celebration of the emperor's anniversaries with games and public banquets. By design, New Rome was to feel like a continuation of the Roman tradition, assuring citizens that the empire's glory had simply moved to a new home. Yet for all these similarities, Constantinople was not a mere copy of Rome. It was also a bold departure. The city's orientation and culture marked a significant shift. Latin remained the language of the imperial court and the army, but Greek quickly became the dominant tongue in the marketplaces and council chambers of Constantinople, reflecting its location in the historically Hellenic East. The cosmopolitan populace was a mix of people from Greece, Asia Minor, the Levant, and beyond, giving the city a different social character from old Roman society. Unlike in Rome, where ancient aristocratic families claimed power and influence, Constantinople's elite was largely composed of newer families, military officers, provincial governors, and courtiers whom Constantine had elevated. These people owed their status to imperial favor and were more beholden to the emperor. As a result, the political atmosphere in New Rome was in some ways more straightforward. Power flowed directly from the imperial palace without the complicated dance of senatorial factions that Rome had known. The old institutions were adapted to fit a more centralized, autocratic style of rule suited to Constantine's vision. In the early years, Constantinople even lacked some traditional offices, as a reminder that it was a new creation. But this also meant the city was free from the entrenched bureaucratic corruption that sometimes plagued Rome. The fresh administrative slate allowed Constantine to mold governance in the city to his purposes. The religious landscape of Constantinople differed dramatically from that of Rome. Instead of temples to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva dominating the skyline, one saw the silhouettes of newly built churches dedicated to Christ, the apostles, and the saints. The city's main sanctuary was not a pagan capital, but a Christian cathedral. This shift had profound symbolic importance. In Rome, the heart of civic life had long been the old temples and the altar of victory in the Senate. In Constantinople, it was the churches and the presence of the cross that set the tone. Constantine's city had been dedicated with Christian rites, and it lacked a Capitolium, a temple to the triad of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, equivalent. Instead, Constantine reportedly installed a relic of the true cross in his palace and promoted the observance of Christian festivals in the city calendar. The old pagan gods were thus sidelined. A statue of Tyche, traditionally the patron goddess of a city's fortune, still existed, but the Tyche of Constantinople was said to hold a cornucopia and a cross, signaling the union of prosperity and Christian faith. It was a stark contrast to the forums of Rome, where pagan altars still stood in Constantine's day. In Constantinople, the message was clear. The empire's new center was looking toward the future and the new religion, rather than back at the pagan past. This blend of old forms and new spirit made the city unique. Constantinople mirrored Rome's physical magnificence and ceremonial pageantry, but it also stood as a symbol of how the empire was changing, becoming more Eastern-oriented, more autocratic in governance, and more Christian in identity. In its first years, Constantinople faced the challenge of becoming a true imperial capital, essentially from scratch. When Constantine dedicated the city in 330, it still lacked some of the fine-grained institutions and social structures that Rome had developed over many centuries. For example, initially the new capital did not yet have a fully developed urban administration. Constantine appointed a governor, proconsul, for the city, but the office of urban prefect, so crucial in Rome, would only be established in Constantinople later on. Likewise, some traditional magistracies and guilds were not immediately present. These gaps highlighted that the new capital was still a work in progress. Building an entire city at breakneck speed also created practical hurdles. The whirlwind of construction had to be coordinated carefully to avoid chaos. Labor and materials were marshaled from across the empire, but shortages and delays were inevitable when raising walls and monuments in just a few years. Certain public services, like extensive aqueducts or a large sewer system, would need to catch up in the years after the founding. Moreover, a freshly built city needed people, citizens to fill the streets, serve in the army, tend the shops, and bring it to life. Constantinople in 330 was grand in appearance, but still somewhat underpopulated and raw. Ensuring a stable food supply for this growing metropolis was another pressing concern. The city's location had many advantages, but feeding a large urban population was a logistical challenge, especially since Constantinople was surrounded by sea on most sides and had little hinterland of its own. All these issues meant that Constantine's bold plan still required careful tending in its infancy. To ensure the city's success, Constantine took bold and imaginative measures. He knew that people were the lifeblood of any capital, so he set out to attract inhabitants from all corners of the empire. The emperor declared that anyone who built a house or established a business in Constantinople would receive certain privileges and even stipends. Wealthy senatorial families were encouraged to take up residence. Constantine offered them estates in the nearby countryside of Thrace and sumptuous palaces within the city walls. For merchants and craftsmen, tax incentives and ready customers awaited in the new capital. Perhaps the most dramatic step was guaranteeing the city's food supply to rival that of Rome. In 332 AD, Constantine announced that Constantinople's residents would receive free distributions of grain, much like the citizens of Rome had long enjoyed. Vast shipments of Egyptian grain were now diverted to the harbors of the Golden Horn. Historical records tell us that by the mid-330s, some 80,000 daily rations of bread were being handed out to the populace from state granaries in Constantinople, an enormous bounty that testified to the emperor's commitment. This grain dole instantly made life in the city more secure and attractive, drawing in masses of immigrants seeking a better life under the imperial hand. At the same time, Constantine stimulated private building by granting land from his estates to anyone willing to construct houses in the city. New neighborhoods thus sprang up, funded by imperial generosity and the ambition of settlers. The emperor also saw to it that entertainment and culture blossomed. He sponsored games, races, and festivals to keep the new Constantinopolitans delighted and proud of their home. Little by little, these efforts paid off. The broad avenues of Constantinople began to fill with the vibrancy of daily life. Traders from Syria hawking their wares in the forums, sailors unloading goods at the docks, senators in flowing togas hurrying to assemblies, and builders still at work expanding the port and walls. Before long, the city's markets were abuzz with commerce and its streets busy with residents who started to call the place home. The harbor quays that had been quiet now saw constant traffic, grain ships from Alexandria, marble-laden barges from the islands, and merchant vessels from the Black Sea all crowding in to feed the growing capital. Workshops and bazaars proliferated under the covered arcades, selling everything from fine silk and spices to everyday pottery. The sounds of many languages, Latin, Greek, Syriac, Coptic, and more, could be heard as the empire's diversity converged on this new urban magnet. By the mid-330s, Constantinople already possessed a lively character and a civic identity that people were beginning to boast of. The early challenges were gradually overcome by Constantine's hands-on stewardship. The city was no longer an empty shell adorned with monuments. It had become a functioning organism. When the emperor rode through the streets, perhaps on his way to the hippodrome or returning from a campaign, he would be greeted by throngs of citizens who had benefited from his vision, a population that now saw itself as belonging to the Queen of Cities, as Constantinople would later be called. There was a sense of triumph in the air. The skeptical voices that once said a new capital could never rival ancient Rome were starting to fall silent. In ceremonial gatherings, orators praised New Rome as the rising glory of the world. By 337 AD, on the eve of Constantine's passing, the city had weathered its initial growing pains and stood as a shining testament to his reign. Constantinople was securely established as the eastern heart of the empire, a bustling and fortified center of power that would only grow in stature in the years ahead. The founding of Constantinople carried immense significance, both for Constantine's contemporaries and for the course of history to come. In Constantine's own time, the rise of this splendid city in the east signified the beginning of a new chapter for the Roman Empire. It was a bold statement that the center of gravity of Roman power had shifted. The traditional capital, Rome, remained venerated, but it was clear that the empire was no longer anchored to the Tiber. To many, this shift was pragmatic. The empire was now being governed from a more central and secure location. To others, especially the growing Christian populace, it was almost providential. Here was a Roman capital where churches, not temples, held pride of place, where a Christian emperor could promote the faith openly and lavishly. For bishops and theologians of the era, Constantinople's creation was a hopeful sign that the Roman state and the Christian church were moving forward hand in hand. Pagan philosophers and old Roman aristocrats, on the other hand, viewed the change with more ambivalence. Some saw it as the end of an era, the sun setting on Rome's primacy. But even they could not deny the practical logic of Constantine's choice. Constantinople's very location, bridging Europe and Asia, symbolized an empire that was embracing its Eastern heritage and connections. Culturally, it promised a fusion of Roman governance with Hellenic art and learning. Politically, It was the emperor's attempt to rejuvenate the empire's administration by distancing it from the old factions and troubles of Rome. In the hearts of the people who moved there, Constantinople stood as a symbol of renewal, a new Rome for a new age, unburdened by the failures and sorrows of the past. Constantinople's establishment also had far-reaching practical effects that would only become fully apparent with time. Strategically, the decision to base the imperial government there proved wise. The eastern provinces, from the Balkans to Egypt, were the richest and most populous parts of the empire in the 4th century. By governing from Constantinople, Constantine and his successors could respond more swiftly to threats along the Danube frontier, the Black Sea coast, or the Persian border. The city's formidable defensive position, ringed by water and later by massive triple walls, would shield the imperial treasury, archives, and army headquarters from the kind of sudden invasions that had occasionally threatened Rome. Indeed, in subsequent centuries, Constantinople stood as the empire's great bastion. When waves of Goths and Huns swept across Europe, they battered at the gates of Constantinople in vain, even as the Western Roman Empire crumbled. In 410 AD, Rome itself was sacked by the Visigoths, an unthinkable calamity in earlier times. Yet, the new Rome endured. It became a safe harbor for Roman statehood, preserving Roman law, state institutions, and classical knowledge through turbulent times. This endurance was very much a consequence of Constantine's foresight in placing the capital where he did. The city also grew into a thriving economic engine. By drawing merchants and resources to the crossroads of trade, Constantinople enriched the imperial treasury. Over the centuries, it amassed wealth that funded armies and fortifications, enabling the Eastern Empire, known to historians as the Byzantine Empire, to survive long after the West fell. In essence, Constantine's choice to found Constantinople ensured that the Roman Empire would have a second life. The city would famously last 1,000 years after Constantine, finally falling only in 1453, an astonishing legacy for a project born in 330. Though Constantine could not have known the details of this future, the groundwork he laid certainly made it possible. In the more immediate sense, by 337 AD, Constantinople had become a living symbol of Constantine's own legacy and vision. The city bore his name, Constantinopolis, City of Constantine, ensuring that his memory would be enshrined in the very map of the world. The citizens who walked its marbled streets each day were beneficiaries of his grand experiment. Many of them had literally been fed, employed, or housed thanks to the emperor's policies. When Constantine fell ill in 337 and prepared to be baptized, fittingly in the waters near his city, it was to Constantinople that he returned in his final days. He died that May, and his body was laid to rest with great honor in the Church of the Holy Apostles, the very church he had built for his tomb. Mourners in the city wept and prayed at the loss of the founder who had given them New Rome. It was a peaceful and reverent passing, unmarred by violence, a contrast to the fate of many earlier Roman emperors. Constantine left behind a stable succession. His sons would take up rule, and a capital imbued with the purpose he had given it. In the streets of Constantinople, life went on calmly after the emperor's death. There were no riots or power struggles in the city. Such was the solidity of the institutions he had planted. Constantinople itself became perhaps the greatest part of Constantine's legacy. Long after his dynasty ended, the city remained the seat of empire, Emperors who never knew Constantine personally still rode through the Golden Gate of Constantinople and felt the aura of his achievement around them. The people continue to celebrate the city's anniversary each year on May 11th with festivities, remembering the extraordinary circumstances of its founding. In this calm and storied beginning, one can imagine the twilight of Constantine's reign in his new capital. Perhaps in the cool evenings, the aging emperor might walk on the palace portico overlooking the bustling hippodrome, or gaze at the sunset gilding the waters around his city. He would see a Constantinople that had grown from dusty construction to a vibrant metropolis, children playing in the squares, traders closing their stalls as lamps were lit along the colonnades, priests chanting vespers in the churches. The scene would have brought a quiet satisfaction to Constantine's heart. He had, against all odds, forged a new Rome that embodied both the old empire's might and the new Christian spirit. The city's lamps reflecting on the Bosporus at nightfall must have seemed to him like stars brought down to earth, a promise that his empire's light would continue to shine in the east, even as dusk fell elsewhere. Constantinople's early years were marked by hope and steady growth, like a strong and youthful tree taking root. In the gentle narrative of those years, one finds no wild drama or mythic miracle, but rather the careful planning and deep conviction of a ruler building for the future. The symbolic and practical implications of establishing New Rome were immense. It showed that the Roman Empire could adapt, relocate, and be reborn. Under the watchful eyes of Constantine the Great, the city of Constantinople began its long life calmly, slowly, and purposefully. This new capital, part mirror of old Rome, part beacon of a changed world, would guard the legacy of Rome and the Christian faith for centuries to come. And so, as the empire's old and new blended under the stars, the foundation was laid for a millennium of history, all resting securely on Constantine's grand and tranquil creation. The old emperor's story came to rest in the gentle summer of 337 AD. Constantine the Great passed away in quiet at his palace after a long reign. In the silence that followed, his three sons, grown men now, met on the plains of Pannonia to arrange the future. They took oaths to share the vast Roman world, each taking a corner. To prevent others from stirring unrest, they quietly removed every other claimant. In this calm reordering, the empire was carved into three parts. Constantius II took the eastern provinces and the new city of Constantinople for himself. Constantine II received the western lands of Britain, Gaul, and Spain. And their youngest brother, Constans, took Italy, the heart of the old empire, along with Africa and parts of the Central Balkans. Each brother set up his own court and administration. In the peaceful months that followed, life continued in the cities and countryside as though nothing had changed. Children still played in the streets and farmers tended their fields. The Roman world felt momentarily whole, even though it was divided. But this calm would soon be tested by the ambitions of men. In the gentle days that followed the division, tensions lay hidden. In 340 AD, Constantine II, the eldest brother, grew restless and set his sights on more. While Constans was busy along the Danube, Constantine II marched his legions into Italy. There, near the city of Aquileia, a sudden ambush caught him by surprise. By evening, the field was silent and tragic. Constantine II had fallen. leaving Constans and Constantius to divide the world between them, but their peace was short-lived. In 350 AD, one of Constance's generals, Magnentius, rose in rebellion in Gaul and proclaimed himself emperor. With swift force, Magnentius drove Constans from power. Constans fled toward Spain, but was caught in the hills and lost his life. By the spring of 351 AD, Constantius II stood alone as emperor, his two brothers gone. Yet unrest still lingered in the wings of the empire. Still another commander, Vetranio, had declared himself emperor along the Danube, and even a distant kinsman named Nepotianus had briefly taken Rome. Constans moved quickly. He persuaded Vetranio to step aside and crushed Nepotianus before he could gather strength. Then Constans finally turned his attention to Magnentius. In great battles fought in 351 and 353 AD, at Mursa and at Mons Seleucus, the imperial forces prevailed. Magnentius was defeated and soon took his own life. Thus, after many turbulent years, the pieces of the Roman world were stitched back together under one ruler again. Now alone on the throne, Constantius II endeavored to heal the empire's wounds. He was raised a devout Christian by his father, and he wished to bind the realm together under one faith. In practice, he spent his years on the march, winters in Milan, summers in Antioch, tending to the far frontiers. Year after year, he faced the Persians under King Shapur II to the east, beating back their invasions and keeping Syria and Mesopotamia safe. He also led campaigns against barbarians on the Rhine and Danube, warding off Alemanni and Sarmatians to protect Gaul in the Balkans. Constantius seldom sought to conquer new lands. Rather, he kept the borders secure, as a shepherd guards his flock. Alongside these struggles, Constantius carefully shaped the laws and beliefs of the empire. He favored a form of Christianity known today as Arianism, a version of the faith he had learned in his youth, and he repeatedly summoned church councils to try to unite the bishops. From his capital, he issued edicts. He forbade pagan sacrifices and rewarded Christian acts of charity. Life in the cities reflected this change. Many churches were built or enlarged, and some old temples grew quiet. Though his policies were firm, he tempered them with care, for many Romans still honored the ancient gods. He often spoke of unity, hoping that a single creed might bind all the people of the empire into one community. Julian became emperor in 361 AD in a way no one had planned. He had been a quiet scholar among the imperial family, spending much time in study. In 355, he had been made Caesar and sent to Gaul, where he proved a capable and gentle leader. His victories against raiding tribes in Gaul won him popularity with the soldiers. Then, while Constantius II was preparing to confront him, Julian's troops unexpectedly proclaimed him emperor. Soon after, Constantius died suddenly on that journey, and Julian took the throne without a final clash. Julian was different from the men who came before him. A philosopher at heart, he loved the old Roman and Greek ways. Though he had grown up among Christians, he turned to the worship of the ancient gods, believing in their wisdom. He spoke of Jupiter, Apollo, and others as if they still listened from the sky. He carried out these changes calmly and with confidence, as if guided by his own convictions. Once emperor, Julian revived the rituals of old in a gentle but deliberate way. He opened many temples and held festivals that had long been silent. He welcomed back priests of the ancient religion, even sponsoring new sacrifices of grain and wine to the gods. At the same time, he allowed bishops of Christ to return from exile, believing that open debate would sharpen true belief. He spoke of building a great temple in Jerusalem as well, though that plan met strange obstacles. In all of this he acted with mild determination, not out of cruelty but out of conviction, hoping to weave the old faith back into everyday Roman life. Julian's reign was brief, like the flash of a comet. In 363, he led a campaign across the Euphrates against Persia. There, far from home, fate found him. He was struck down by an arrow in an autumn storm, and soon the army returned to tell the world their emperor was dead. With him passed the state's favor to paganism. The old temples grew silent again, and the people turned once more to the cross. Julian's last moments were quiet and dignified, but history would remember him as the final Roman emperor who openly honored the ancient gods. After Julian's death, the empire once more aligned under Christian emperors. In 364 AD, the army chose two brothers to rule, Valentinian I in the west and his younger sibling Valens in the east. Both were Christians, but they worshipped differently. Valentinian followed the Nicene Creed of his grandfather, while Valens continued the Arian faith of the Eastern Church. Valentinian generally protected all religions. He even gave a Christian statue a place in the Great Temple at Rome while outlawing violent magic. Valens, on the other hand, favored his own Arian bishops and banished some Nicene leaders, though he did not seek to punish pagans. Under their governance, churches grew in size and number, and Christianity in its various forms spread widely. Yet the old temples still stood, and in quiet villages ancient traditions were not yet forgotten. In this era, the empire felt like a tapestry of different beliefs, with Christianity dominant but not yet covering every thread. While the empire managed these internal transformations, a great storm gathered beyond its borders. North of the Danube River, the mighty Gothic tribes, now commonly called the Visigoths and Ostrogoths, lived in forests beyond Rome's frontier. In the late 370s, they felt pressure from the warlike Huns, a fierce people pushing them south. In 376 AD, a large group of Goths crossed the Danube into Roman lands seeking safety. The Roman leaders, hoping to use them as allies, foederati, allowed these thousands of Goths to settle in the province of Thrace in return for military service. They were given land to farm and promised food. At first, this arrangement was uneasy but peaceful. Winter came, and in 377, reports of trouble drifted toward the capital. Some Roman officials were cruel. They seized the best food and sold it for profit, leaving little for the settlers. Anger grew quietly in the Gothic camps. By the spring of 378, the Goths, under their chiefs Fritigern and Alaviv, had united in rebellion. They took up arms not far from the city of Adrianople, determined to fight for fair treatment. Emperor Valens, hearing of the revolt, rode quickly from his eastern capital to meet the Goths. In August 378, he faced them on a plain outside Adrianople. The two armies clashed under a hot sun. The conflict was fierce, but the Romans were caught off guard by the Goths' surprise tactics. By the end of the day, the outcome was clear. The Roman line had broken, and Valens was among the fallen. In the dim light that followed, the news spread slowly and dreadfully. The emperor himself was dead. The sky seemed to pause as the empire learned of its misfortune. Adrianople had become one of Rome's darkest hours. The eastern army was shattered, and a beloved emperor lay gone in the dust of battle. In early 379, the eastern throne was empty. The young western emperor Gratian appointed Theodosius, a man of honor and deep faith, to govern the east. Theodosius arrived quietly in Thessalonica that winter. He was tall and thoughtful, and he took the reins, determined to stabilize the troubled empire. His first acts were wise and patient. He negotiated peace with the Goths. In 382, he agreed to settle many of them on Roman land as federates, giving them grain and plowshares in return for service. This brought a lasting peace on the northern frontier. Theodosius proved himself in the west as well. In 394, he marched against a usurper named Eugenius, and with his great general Stilicho, he won a victory at the river Frigidus, reuniting most of the empire. Throughout his reign, he wore the Christian cross and sought guidance from bishops like St. Ambrose in Milan. He was deeply pious and had been baptized, though he favored Nicene Christianity above all else. In 380, after recovering from illness, he issued the famous Edict of Thessalonica. It declared that the Nicene faith was the official religion of the empire. Other Christian beliefs were called heresy, and those refusing the Nicene Creed were no longer protected by law. In 391, Theodosius took a further step against the old traditions. He ordered that all pagan sacrifices be banned and that the ancient temples be closed. Many pagans were startled as the statues of their gods were toppled or left to gather dust. With gentle firmness, he proclaimed that Christ was the one true head of state, and he aimed to see churches flourish in every town. Under his rule, the empire changed in body and soul. It became in law and practice a land of churches more than shrines. Theodosius guided the empire with patience and calm. His reign brought lasting shape to the old Roman world. In every city, life now often centered on the bishop's throne and the days of holy feast. He also strengthened the empire's laws, working to bring peace both within and without. But above all, he hoped his people would live in harmony. At his death in 395 in Milan, the sun set on both his reign and the united empire. He left behind 2 young sons to inherit the future, and thus an era came quietly to its close. When Emperor Theodosius I died in 395, the Roman Empire was formally divided between his 2 sons, Honorius in the west and Arcadius in the east. This marked the beginning of a definitive political separation that had long been developing. The Western Roman Empire, already weakened by internal strife and external pressures, would soon collapse. The Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, would endure and evolve into what we now call the Byzantine Empire. In the West, Honorius began his reign under the guardianship of Stilicho, a capable general of Vandal Roman ancestry. Stilicho fought to preserve Roman authority, defeating invading Gothic forces led by Alaric at the Battle of Pollentia in 402. Despite these victories, the empire's stability remained fragile. The imperial court moved from Milan to Ravenna in 402 for better protection, signaling a growing defensiveness in the Western leadership. Stilicho's execution in 408, due to court intrigues and suspicions of disloyalty, left a power vacuum. The Romans, in a panic, massacred many of their Gothic Federate soldiers, pushing thousands to join Alaric's cause. In 410, Alaric's Visigoths entered and sacked Rome. Though the sack was relatively restrained, it shocked the Roman world. Rome had not fallen to an enemy in over 800 years, and the psychological impact was immense. Meanwhile, the Western Empire's hold on its provinces was weakening. Britain was effectively abandoned around 410. In Gaul and Spain, various Germanic tribes, Visigoths, Franks, Vandals, Suebi, established their own kingdoms. In 439, the Vandals captured Carthage, depriving the empire of its most critical grain supply. Italy itself was threatened repeatedly, and by the mid-5th century, the Western Emperor had little real power. In 455, Rome was sacked again, this time by the Vandals. They looted the city for 2 weeks but refrained from wholesale destruction. Still, the city's treasures were taken and many Romans were carried away as captives. The event further exposed the hollowness of the Western Empire. Elsewhere, Attila the Hun's invasions in the 440s and early 450s brought terror across Gaul and Italy. Although he was turned back after the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451 and a diplomatic meeting with Pope Leo I in 452, the threat underscored the West's vulnerability. After Attila's death in 453, the Hunnic Empire quickly fractured, but by then the Western Roman Empire had little strength left to reassert itself. By the 470s, the Western throne had become a puppet post controlled by barbarian generals. In 476, Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain, deposed the last emperor, the young Romulus Augustulus. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to the Eastern emperor in Constantinople, symbolizing the end of the Western Roman Empire. No replacement emperor was appointed in the West, yet while the West collapsed, the East stood firm. Constantinople remained well protected by massive walls and a strong navy. Its location ensured control over key trade routes, and its population remained dense and urbanized. The Eastern Empire retained a functioning bureaucracy, tax system, and military structure. Under Arcadius and his successors, including Theodosius II and Marcian, the Eastern Empire experienced relative stability. The Theodosian walls, constructed in the early 5th century, rendered Constantinople nearly impregnable. The publication of the Theodosian Code in 438 helped organize imperial law, reinforcing administrative coherence. Religiously, the East took a leading role in Christian doctrinal debates. The Council of Ephesus in 431 and the Council of Chalcedon in 451 helped shape Orthodox Christian theology. Emperors in the East actively involved themselves in ecclesiastical matters, tying imperial authority closely to the Church. Despite occasional revolts and threats, the Eastern Empire's core provinces, Asia Minor, the Balkans, Syria, and Egypt, remained largely intact. These regions provided food, manpower, and wealth. The East also maintained a cautious but mostly stable relationship with the Sassanid Persian Empire to its east. In contrast to the West's disintegration, the East adapted. While it faced internal and external challenges, its centralized administration, economic base, and military discipline allowed it to survive. Over time, the Eastern Roman Empire developed its own distinct identity, gradually becoming less Roman and more Byzantine in language, culture, and governance. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 was a significant milestone, but it did not mark the end of Roman civilization. In the East, Roman institutions continued. The emperors in Constantinople still considered themselves Roman and maintained traditions of governance and law that dated back centuries. This period, then, is not simply a story of collapse. It is also a story of endurance. While one half of the empire crumbled under pressure, the other half held on, adapted, and prepared to carry the Roman legacy into the medieval world. In 527, a gentle sunrise bathed Constantinople as a new emperor took the throne. Flavius Petrus Sabatius, born of humble parents in the Balkan countryside, had been raised in the capital by his uncle, Emperor Justin. He had received the finest education and military training. Now, as Justin lay dying, his nephew was ready to rule. On a clear April day, Justinian ascended to the purple and was crowned Augustus in the great church of Hagia Sophia, standing hand in hand with his beloved wife, Theodora. He was now the ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire, which many still called Rome. As the new emperor looked out over the marble battlements of Constantinople, he felt the weight of two worlds upon his shoulders, the legacy of ancient Rome and the realities of his own time. The empire he ruled had lost most of its western provinces. In Africa, the Vandals held Carthage. In Italy, the Ostrogoths reigned in Ravenna. Yet Justinian believed those lands still belonged to Rome's heirs. He vowed to reclaim them. At home, he set his household in order as well. He reorganized the government, appointing able men to key posts and outlawing the corrupt sale of offices. He turned to the law, convening a commission of jurists led by the learned Tribonian. Over the next years, 529 to 534, they compiled the scattered laws of Rome into one great code, the Corpus Juris Civilis, a body of law that would bring order and justice to the empire for ages to come. Beside Justinian throughout all this stood Empress Theodora. Born only a few years after Justinian in the capital, She had risen from a very humble life. Legend said she had once even performed before crowds in the Hippodrome, but her wit and compassion set her apart. As empress, Theodora became a true partner in rule. Justinian often turned to her wise counsel. She fiercely championed the downtrodden. Widows, orphans, and the poor became her charges. In council, she spoke for women's rights. Thanks to her influence, laws were passed to protect women. Young girls could not be forced into prostitution, and mothers were given guardianship rights over their children. She even strengthened the laws so that a woman deserted by her husband would not be left destitute. Theodora's strength balanced Justinian's, and together they ruled as equals, co-emperors in all but name. The bright stability of the capital was shattered in the winter of 532. In the Hippodrome of Constantinople, the thunder of chariot races turned to uproar. The fans of the rival blue and green factions, who usually cheered colorfully at games, suddenly united in fury against the emperor. The words Nika, Nika rang out, at first a cry of victory, but soon a cry of revolt. Over the course of a week, the crowd surged through the streets. Flames rose as rioters set fire to buildings. They destroyed parts of the imperial palace, the Senate house, and even the previous Hagia Sophia. The city trembled in chaos, and by night the skyline was ablaze. Faced with this fury, Justinian felt himself cornered. He even made plans to flee the city for safety. But Empress Theodora, standing beside him in regal purple, would not hear of it. She declared that she would rather die on the throne than live in exile. Death by her husband's side was a nobler fate than abandoning their responsibilities. Her words steeled the emperor's resolve. He ordered his loyal commanders into action. Among them was Belisarius, a masterful general, trusted since his youth. In a sudden, hushed operation, Justinian's troops moved into the Hippodrome, where the rebels had gathered. The clash was swift and decisive. By dawn, the uprising had been crushed. Many rebels fell in the fighting. The city fell quiet once more. Order had been restored, but Justinian knew the price had been high. In the days after the revolt, Justinian and Theodora surveyed a city in ruin. Ashes and rubble lined the streets of Constantinople, yet from this devastation, the emperor saw a chance for renewal. He called for architects and builders from across the empire. Among all the projects, one stood above the rest: a new church, more glorious than any Christian temple Rome had seen. Over the next few years, workers labored day and night. Great stone blocks were hauled and set. Skilled artisans laid dazzling mosaics of gold and glass. By 537, the great church of Hagia Sophia was complete. Its vast dome, resting on columns and pendentives, seemed to float on air, and sunlight poured in through a ring of windows. Justinian entered the temple with awe, remarking to its architects that they had surpassed even the Temple of Solomon in splendor. This great cathedral stood as a symbol of the renewed glory of Justinian's reign, yet it was only part of his building legacy. All over the capital he had walls repaired, baths built, monasteries established, and a hospital opened. The city glittered with new wonders, monuments to the emperor's vision. While the splendor of Constantinople grew, Justinian did not forget the wider world he claimed for Rome. In 533, just a year after the Nika revolt, the emperor launched a great expedition to the west. A mighty fleet of warships and transports set sail for North Africa. There, the Vandals had ruled for more than a century, from their capital of Carthage. The Vandal king Gelimer had even deposed a pro-Roman ruler and was persecuting the local Christians. Justinian sent his best general, Belisarius, to deal with this threat. The campaign was astonishingly swift. Belisarius landed in August 533, and by the spring of 534, the Vandals were completely defeated. Carthage fell to the Byzantines. Gelimer fled and surrendered, and the Vandal kingdom vanished. Africa, including Carthage, the islands of Corsica, Sardinia, Sicily, and the coast of Tunisia was restored to Roman rule. Justinian reorganized the province. A new governor was installed, and Roman law was re-established. With Africa secured, the Mediterranean was once again a safer place for Roman ships and trade.